What happened in western Ukraine did not begin with an explosion, nor with sirens, nor with the familiar images of burning buildings. It began with something far more unsettling, a low vibration, a deep tremor that people could feel under their feet. In several areas near Lviv, residents reported a strange shaking that did not resemble a conventional airstrike. Windows rattled, walls hummed. For a brief moment, many thought it was an earthquake. And that moment matters. Because in modern warfare, fear does not always arrive as fire. Sometimes it arrives as uncertainty. This event was not simply about physical damage. It was about perception signaling and psychological pressure. Western Ukraine has long been treated as a strategic rear zone, a space assumed to be relatively safe from the most advanced forms of attack. That assumption was quietly challenged. Not with mass destruction, but with precision and timing. The strike occurred shortly after high-level diplomatic meetings in Europe, at a moment when many believed escalation would be avoided. Instead, the opposite signal was sent. The message was subtle but deliberate. Distance no longer guarantees safety. Geography no longer provides insulation. What matters here is not the scale of destruction, but the nature of the tool used. Analysts quickly began asking whether this was an experimental deployment, a demonstration, or a carefully calibrated warning. Some compared the sensation to underground shock waves, others to the aftereffects of deep penetration munitions. None of these explanations need to be confirmed for the strategic effect to work. In deterrence theory, ambiguity can be as powerful as certainty. By allowing observers to speculate, the attacker forces adversaries to imagine worst-case scenarios. That imagination spreads faster than facts. This is the core of modern psychological warfare. Not overwhelming force, but controlled unease. And Western Ukraine, by design, was the perfect stage. Far from the front lines, close to NATO borders, and deeply symbolic as a logistical artery. This was not about winning territory. It was about reshaping assumptions. The question is no longer what was hit, but why this place, at this moment, in this way. Because once assumptions collapse, strategy must be rewritten. To understand the weight of this strike, one must understand Lviv and Western Ukraine not as geography, but as function. For months, even years, this region has served as a logistical backbone. Weapons, aid, fuel, and personnel have through it from Central Europe toward the front. It is also a psychological anchor. For both Ukrainian civilians and Western planners, Western Ukraine represented continuity, stability, and control, a place where war existed on maps, not in daily life. That perception was valuable. It sustained morale and enabled long-term planning. By selecting this region, the attacker was not seeking immediate tactical gains. Instead, the objective was strategic disruption. When rear areas feel exposed, every calculation changes. Supply routes must be reconsidered. Air defense assets must be redistributed. Political leaders must answer uncomfortable questions from their populations. Even if the physical damage is limited, the strategic ripple effect is immense. Historically, great powers have always targeted logistics before armies. From rail hubs in the Second World War to energy infrastructure in late 20th century conflicts, the logic is consistent. Cut the arteries, and the body weakens on its own. What makes this case different is proximity. Western Ukraine sits uncomfortably close to NATO territory. Any action there inevitably sends signals beyond Ukraine itself. It forces European capitals to reassess their own vulnerability, not because an attack is imminent, but because the margin of safety appears thinner than previously believed. This is how escalation works in modern geopolitics. Not through declarations, but through calibrated moves that force reassessment. By demonstrating reach rather than destruction, the attacker communicates capability while maintaining plausible restraint. This is an old strategy updated with new technology. The goal is to unsettle without provoking immediate retaliation, to remind adversaries that escalation ladders exist and that others may be willing to climb higher faster. In this context, Lviv is not a city. It is a symbol of Western involvement, of logistical depth, and of assumed protection. Challenging that symbol does not require flattening it. It only requires proving that it is reachable. Once reach is demonstrated, deterrence dynamics shift. The center of gravity moves away from the battlefield and toward political decision-making rooms across Europe. Much of the speculation following the strike focused not on what was destroyed, but on how the effect was produced. Reports of deep vibrations, short warning times, and limited interception fed into a broader discussion about modern precision weapons. In contemporary warfare, the most powerful systems are not always those with the largest payloads, but those that compress time and overwhelm perception. High-speed precision weapons reduce reaction windows to minutes or even seconds. They challenge traditional air defense logic, which was built around detection, tracking, and layered response. When reaction time collapses, even advanced systems begin to look fragile. The psychological effect of this is profound. Defenders are forced to assume that some strikes will get through. That assumption alone changes behavior. It leads to dispersion, hesitation, and defensive overinvestment. Importantly, this does not require nuclear capability. Conventional systems, if fast and accurate enough, can achieve strategic effects once reserved for weapons of mass destruction. This is where the concept of artificial seismic impact enters the discussion. A deep penetrating strike can transmit energy through the ground, creating shock waves that feel unnatural to civilians. The sensation itself becomes part of the weapon. People remember earthquakes. They associate them with uncontrollable natural forces. When a man-made strike mimics that sensation, it blurs the line between nature and warfare. That blur amplifies fear. Analysts have noted that such effects are especially potent in urban environments with older infrastructure. Again, the goal is not annihilation, but intimidation through demonstration. By using a weapon that feels unfamiliar, the attacker forces defenders into a learning curve. And learning curves in war are costly. This also sends a message outward. If such systems can be deployed selectively, they can be scaled. If they can be scaled, they must be accounted for in every future contingency. This is how arms races begin, not with declarations, but with demonstrations. Each demonstration forces the other side to invest and respond. Over time, the balance shifts not because one side wants war, but because neither side wants vulnerability. In that sense, the strike in western Ukraine was less about today and more about shaping tomorrow's battlefield expectations. The reaction from NATO capitals following the strike was notably restrained. There were statements of concern, reaffirmations of support, and calls for de-escalation, but no dramatic shift in posture. This restraint is not weakness. It reflects a deeper dilemma that has defined alliance strategy for decades. How do you respond to a demonstration of capability without validating the logic behind it? If the response is too strong, escalation risks spiral beyond control. If it is too weak, deterrence erodes. The strike near western Ukraine sits precisely in that gray zone. It does not cross formal red lines, yet it brushes against them closely enough to test credibility. This is where realism dominates rhetoric. NATO leaders understand that deterrence is not about reacting emotionally, but about preserving long-term stability. At the same time, they must consider domestic audiences who increasingly question assumptions of safety. The alliance faces a classic security dilemma. Every defensive measure can be interpreted as preparation for offense. Every restraint can be interpreted as hesitation. History offers few clean solutions. During the Cold War, similar dilemmas played out repeatedly from Berlin to Cuba. Then, as now, ambiguity was both a danger and a tool. What complicates the present is technology. Speed compresses decision-making. Precision lowers thresholds. Psychological effects travel instantly through media and social networks. This magnifies pressure on political leaders to respond quickly, often before full analysis is possible. In this environment, restraint becomes harder to maintain, yet it is precisely restraint that prevents miscalculation. The strike forces NATO to quietly reevaluate assumptions without publicly overreacting. Air defense planning, logistics routing, and strategic communication all come under review. None of this needs to be announced to be effective. In realist terms, the goal is to absorb the signal without amplifying it, to acknowledge capability without rewarding provocation. This balancing act will define the next phase of the conflict. Not dramatic escalation, but sustained pressure adaptation and signaling on all sides. The danger lies not in any single strike, but in accumulated misunderstandings over time. Energy rarely appears dramatic on the battlefield, yet it often decides outcomes more quietly and more decisively than tanks or aircraft. In this conflict, infrastructure tied to energy has become a strategic pressure point rather than a background concern. Underground storage facilities, pipelines, and power distribution nodes are not merely economic assets. They are instruments of endurance. When these systems are perceived as vulnerable, the consequences extend far beyond immediate disruption. Governments must divert resources to protection. Markets respond with volatility. Civilians internalize anxiety about winter, heating, and basic stability. This is why energy infrastructure occupies such a central place in strategic thinking. Targeting or signaling vulnerability around it is not about destruction. It is about leverage. By reminding adversaries that energy security can be shaken without large-scale attacks, pressure is applied indirectly. This form of pressure is difficult to counter. Sanctions can be negotiated, military positions can be reinforced, but fear of cold and scarcity touches societies at a deeper level. In Europe, where energy networks are interconnected and politically sensitive, even limited uncertainty can trigger wide debate. Leaders must balance solidarity with domestic reassurance. This creates friction within alliances, even when public unity remains intact. From a realist perspective, this is efficient coercion. It avoids the moral and political costs of mass violence while still extracting strategic concessions over time. Energy becomes a battlefield where moves are measured in months rather than hours. Each signal forces recalculation. How resilient are reserves? How secure are routes? How patient are populations? These questions linger long after headlines fade. In this sense, energy infrastructure is not collateral to war. It is part of its grammar. Control over it shapes negotiation positions and narrows options. The deeper implication is unsettling. Modern conflict increasingly favors tools that pressure societies indirectly, blurring the line between military action and structural disruption. This is harder to explain to the public, harder to respond to decisively, and easier to deny. That ambiguity makes energy an ideal arena for strategic competition in an age where overt escalation carries unacceptable risks. Beyond the immediate theater, the strike also functioned as communication. Not a speech, not a declaration, but a signal directed primarily toward Washington. In international politics, signals matter most when they are costly enough to be noticed but restrained enough to avoid forcing a response. This balance defines effective course of diplomacy. The message here was not that escalation is inevitable, but that capability exists and can be exercised selectively. From a realist standpoint, this aligns with a long tradition of using limited force to shape negotiation environments. By altering perceptions of risk, one side seeks to enter talks with greater leverage. Importantly, this approach does not require ideological confrontation. It relies on shared understanding of power dynamics. The United States, as a global actor, is familiar with this logic. It has employed similar strategies in different regions and eras. That familiarity makes the signal intelligible even without explicit explanation. The timing reinforces the point. Diplomatic gatherings and high-level discussions create moments of assumed restraint. Acting near such moments disrupts expectations and forces reassessment. It suggests that negotiation and pressure are not sequential. But simultaneous, this complicates diplomatic planning. It raises the cost of delay. At the same time, restraint and scale preserve space for dialogue. This duality is deliberate. It invites engagement while warning against complacency. For Washington, the challenge is interpretation. Overreacting would validate the tactic and accelerate escalation. Ignoring it would invite repetition. The likely response lies in quiet adaptation rather than public confrontation. Adjusting defense planning, reinforcing alliances subtly, signaling resolve through posture rather than rhetoric. This is the language of strategic competition in a multipolar world. It is slow, ambiguous, and psychologically demanding. The real danger lies not in misreading intent, but in misjudging thresholds. Each side tests where the other draws lines. Those lines are rarely declared, they are inferred through patterns. The strike adds a new data point to that pattern, one that Washington must now integrate into its broader assessment of risk and opportunity. For Europe, the implications are both immediate and structural. The continent finds itself once again confronting the uncomfortable reality that security assumptions built over decades may no longer hold. The strike near western Ukraine does not threaten Europe directly, yet it narrows the psychological buffer that once separated conflict zones from perceived safety. This has political consequences. Publics ask whether existing defenses are sufficient. Governments debate spending priorities. Alliances face internal pressure as national interests diverge. Eastern members demand stronger deterrence. Western members emphasize de-escalation. Neither position is inherently wrong. They reflect different risk perceptions shaped by geography and history. This divergence complicates consensus. At the same time, the need for unity has never been greater. Fragmentation would magnify vulnerability. This is the European dilemma: to respond decisively without appearing provocative, to invest in defense without undermining diplomatic credibility, to reassure citizens without feeding fear. These tensions play out slowly, through budget debates, procurement decisions, and strategic reviews. They rarely make headlines, but they shape long-term outcomes. The strike accelerates these processes. It forces conversations that might otherwise have been postponed. In doing so, it exposes fault lines, but also opportunities. A clearer understanding of shared vulnerability can strengthen coordination if managed carefully. The risk is that uneven responses create gaps. Gaps invite pressure. From a strategic perspective, Europe is being tested not militarily, but politically. Can it adapt without overreacting? Can it modernize defenses while keeping channels of communication open? Can it sustain support for partners without exhausting public patience? These questions define the next phase more than any single weapon system. The battlefield is expanding into decision-making structures themselves. Taken together, these developments point toward a broader transformation in how conflict is conducted and understood. The traditional distinction between conventional and strategic weapons is becoming less clear. Precision, speed, and psychological impact allow smaller actions to produce outsized effects. This does not mean total war is inevitable. It means that thresholds are shifting. Deterrence now operates across multiple domains simultaneously. Military, economic, informational, and psychological pressures interact in complex ways. This complexity increases the risk of miscalculation. It also increases the importance of restraint in communication. History offers sobering lessons. Periods of rapid technological change often outpace diplomatic adaptation. When that happens, stability depends less on formal rules and more on judgment. The strike in western Ukraine should be understood in this light, not as an isolated event, but as part of an evolving pattern. A pattern where power is signaled through demonstration rather than declaration, where influence is exerted indirectly, where ambiguity is weaponized. The challenge for all actors is to recognize the shift without surrendering to it. Escalation is not predetermined. Choices still matter. Dialogue still matters. Understanding adversary logic does not mean endorsing it. It means reducing surprise and limiting unintended consequences. The future of this conflict, and others like it, will be shaped by whether leaders can balance firmness with flexibility, whether they can absorb pressure without responding reflexively, whether they can invest in resilience rather than panic. In an era of compressed timelines and amplified perception, wisdom becomes a strategic asset. The lesson here is not that war is expanding uncontrollably, but that its character is changing. Those who adapt thoughtfully may yet prevent the worst outcomes. Those who misread signals may find themselves trapped by dynamics they did not intend to unleash.